Welcome back. A new book's been published examining the role of the former Iraqi exile and politician Ahmad Chalabi in pushing America into a war in Iraq, it says. Discussing that subject, I'm with Emmy Award-winning investigative journalist Aram Roston, as well as Francis Brooke, a long-time advisor to Ahmad Chalabi. Now, just before the break, we were talking about the certain characteristics about Ahmad Chalabi. And Aram, I want to put to you that when I spoke to him back in 2006, I asked him about this thing about him putting informants forward, people saying he put informants forward with information, dealing with informational weapons of mass destruction. And I asked if he bore any responsibility for that, and this is how he responded.
I certainly am not responsible for the killing of anyone. We did not provide faulty intelligence, indeed, or any intelligence on these issues. I feel quite proud of having overthrown the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein, who had killed 2 million people and wounded and maimed an equivalent number in the Iran-Iraq war, in the Kuwait war, and in the wars that he conducted in Iraq. And he has conducted genocide against the people in Kurdistan in the north and also of the people in the south. It is a triumph to get rid of the dictatorship, the totalitarian dictatorship of Saddam Hussein.
Yeah, I wonder, responding to that, I also wonder, how did the US regard the Iraqi National Congress at the time? I mean, how much did it need that kind of partner?
The US was immensely conflicted, and the US agencies have been very conflicted, even within themselves. But the Iraqi National Congress has sort of changed a bit over the years, but it's been funded by the US government. It was funded by the US government for a very long time. First by the CIA, covert funding. Then they cut that off. They stopped. The CIA tried to basically cauterize them off, end any relationship with them. Later on, Congress, Ahmad Chalabi, with the assistance of, again, with Francis Brooke, made a very intensive lobbying campaign here in Washington, D.C., and Congress became a supporter. First, they tried to get funding from Taiwan for a little while for their operations. He wanted funding from some others as well, but Congress eventually began to really support him. Some people in Congress were insistent that the Iraqi National Congress be funded. It was tough to fund them in a sense because the Iraqi National Congress wasn't technically incorporated. It didn't sort of have its own bank accounts and checkbooks and so forth, so it had to eventually find its own group. But the U.S. State Department they weren't very fond of Chalabi's group either, but they were forced to, in essence, to fund it. They were nickel and diming them at first, and eventually the monies really started pouring in. The result of this was, a lot of it was, you mentioned intelligence. There may be intelligence, but it was also a PR campaign or a propaganda campaign that found its way into the U.S. press and the Western press. So it wasn't just intelligence, and sometimes the intelligence didn't go to the intelligence agencies that are traditional because of Ahmad Chalabi's, I think you'd agree, sort of controversial or hostile relationship with the CIA.
Well, I wonder, Francis Brooke, what was behind that? And from your perspective, the fact that Chalabi was friends with the CIA, then sort of dropped, and then it was the State Department, then Defense Department. Why did he sort of flip-flop between various agencies in the U.S.?
Well, I think it's unfortunate that the Central Intelligence Agency has become such a political animal as it has. But I think that in that case, what you're looking at is the Central Intelligence Agency taking an active political role. These choices are supposedly decided under the United States Constitution by the United States Congress and by the President of the United States. And the United States Congress supported the concept of overthrowing Saddam and helping Iraqis establish a democracy. That's the Iraq Liberation Act. That passed unanimously in the United States Senate, and it passed 360 to 36 in the United States House of Representatives. That is the actual expression of the will of the American people. It's unfortunate that the Central Intelligence Agency sees itself as a separate policy maker and feels that it should take on this role of determining United States support for Iraqi democracy or not. And that is a sad story, and it is to the detriment of the United States that it has happened.
Well, let's get a response from you on that, Aram, because I know you want to say something before we get to a caller.
Oh, no, I was just going to talk about, you'd asked how he was so effective with, I think you'd asked, with personal relationships. Right. And there's one little story, and I'm not sure if this is something that Francis came across too, but I tell it, it's based on Qubad Talabani, the son of Jalal Talabani, who was the president of Iraq. And it's a humorous story where he talks about his father eating huge amounts of ice cream. And then he asked his father, who was kind of heavy set. You know, what are you doing? It's not good for you. And it was telling him that. And then his father was telling him, no, Ahmad told me, it's Dr. Chalabi was telling me it's good for me, and he told me it's actually quite healthy and so forth. And the son said, well, he's not a medical doctor, he's a mathematical doctor. The point was he's very convincing, and he may have a point, I don't know, but maybe you've heard that story, I don't know, but he's very convincing and can kind of tell people what they want to hear.
Well, let's get Mohammed on the line with a question from Pakistan. Mohammed, thanks for calling in. What would you like to ask?
I'm just looking at your program because this is democracy. Who will bring the democracy in Iraq? Because when still the U.S. is there, they're killing the innocent people. Everybody, I've been in all over the country.
Right. Mohammed, well, so, I mean, let me put this to Francis Brooke. One of the things, as you say, you know, a lot of people are happy, of course, that Saddam Hussein has gone, but there's still the legacy of the situation in Iraq. It's obviously become a lot more of a tangle, and it seems that a lot more people in this country willing to ask, why is America embroiled in this? And of course, then Ahmad Chalabi's name comes up.
Well, I think it's fair to ask about the United States occupation of Iraq. And I think it's also reasonable for me to point out that Dr. Chalabi was one of the very first and strongest opponents of occupation. And we had an immediate fight with the United States administration, particularly Ambassador Bremer, as he attempted to impose a military occupation on Iraq. Dr. Chalabi was the principal person who was able to push for the creation of the governing council. He was the principal person who overturned the Bremer's plan for a 3-year transition to a constitution and elections. Dr. Chalabi has been in the forefront of demanding that Iraqis be allowed to run their own country. So we continue to be in opposition to occupation. At this point, I must say that the United States and Iraq are so embroiled, and that our relationship is so complicated that it is going to take some time to pull out. But we did not support that approach in the first place. Given where we are now, I think that Dr. Chalabi and the rest of the Iraqis have come to see that the best way forward is to work in concert with the United States and with their regional allies to form a stable or democratic Iraq. I think the chances are good. I've spent 4 of the past 6 months in Iraq, and I can tell you the situation is much better than it has been for some time.
Let's get Habib on the line from Tennessee with a question. Habib.
Yeah, thank you for this good show. My question is for Mr. Francis Brooke. At the beginning of the show, you said that the reason for the war was to bring Saddam down, but actually the United States, the main reason was for the weapons of mass destruction, and I was wondering how come you didn't mention anything about it. The second question is that how come the United States didn't investigate the history of Ahmad Chalabi? And I believe that I heard that history had a dark history about fraud in banking centers in Jordan and stuff. So how come was this not made public? You know.
Thanks, Habib.
Thank you.
Right. Well, on the question of weapons of mass destruction, the issue was what was my motivation, what was Dr. Chalabi's motivation. Our motivation was to overthrow the dictatorship and help Iraqis establish a government that they chose themselves. It is true that the Bush administration chose to highlight the issues of weapons of mass destruction. I don't think that was a good idea, and I think we have been unfortunately blamed for that. We had a very small organization. The Central Intelligence Agency has a huge organization spending $3 billion a year. I think if you want to find a failure on this, you should look at the Central Intelligence Agency rather than trying to blame a poor Iraqi. The second question about Dr. Chalabi's background, all I can tell you is this. I sat with King Hussein of Jordan myself in the Four Seasons Hotel in 1998, and he told me that the charges that he had brought against Dr. Chalabi in a military court were untrue and that he had done it under pressure from Saddam Hussein. And I take that from the horse's mouth because that was the justice system of the Kingdom of Jordan at the time. And I heard that from King Hussein myself. I don't speak Arabic, but I had one of his sons standing there translating for me at the time. So I tell you definitively that is untrue.
Okay, Francis, Aram, there was also the issue of I know you mentioned about the trade bank and the card tech companies, deal being done involving Ahmad Chalabi's relatives as soon as he was...
That's more recent, yeah. Do you mind if I just address quickly
Please.
what was just said? There is an interesting, at least, financial network that disappeared in the late 1980s, early in the 1990s. I think the Chalabi family banking business had to be looked at as a large chain rather than just Petrobank, and it all basically collapsed together over some time. First, the Chalabis ran a bank in Switzerland, which was taken over by the Swiss authorities first, which launched an investigation, and then there was the what took place in Jordan, and then Lebanon and Switzerland, another major operation they ran in Switzerland, where a lot of people lost a lot of money in Switzerland because they weren't protected in any way by banking regulators. And then and the case against him, the criminal conviction was indeed he was an absentia. He wasn't there. It was a criminal case against him. But that is it is as Francis said, the criminal justice system of Jordan.
Right.
Was a military justice system of Jordan.
Yeah,
They
right.
convened a special military
Right.
court for the first time in 22 years.
Francis, I've got to stop you
Okay,
there,
I
unfortunately, because
just-
there's so much to discuss about Ahmad Chalabi. Unfortunately, we ran out of time. I really thank you both for joining us and discussing this. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thanks. And thank you for being with us. On the next show, we talk with Oscar-winning actress Emma Thompson about her battle against the international sex trade. We'll see you next time for that.